Well, welcome everyone. This program is about Afro-Caribbean migration to Florida. It's going to have an emphasis on the Bahamas, but I will be addressing some of the other Afro-Caribbean populations. When we talk about the Caribbean, again, we're talking about this whole set of islands, this archipelago, which actually has like 4 different areas. The Lucayan, which is the Bahamas area, and I think Bermuda. You have the Greater Antilles, which have the islands of Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and these are the larger islands. Then you have the Lesser Antilles, all those islands going across in an arc at the eastern end until we get to the ABC Islands, which are the Dutch and I can't remember the other island who owns it. When we talk about Afro-Caribbean people, we're talking about people who have an ancestry to Africa. Very big ancestry or very small percentage, as we find out in DNA, but this ancestry is also linked to the history of slavery. And most of the Africans who were enslaved were brought to this part of the world, even from the earliest part of slavery. We're going to go into the Caribbean and introduce you to some of the sounds of the Caribbean. And I think this beautiful scene that brings, I'm sure everyone who's sitting here probably at this presentation, if you either live here or have been to Florida, to a Florida sunset. However, as many of my Caribs, fellow Caribs will attest, it also brings to mind the sunsets of their islands. Although I wasn't born in the islands, I have Caribbean ancestry. My parents migrated to the United States in 1948 from Puerto Rico. And I was born in New York City, but I always have felt very closely attached, as many Puerto Ricans, whether they're born in the island and have left or were born here, to their island homelands. My father always said that I had it in my blood. I guess that's that whole idea of feeling this nostalgia when you see this. During the post-Columbian era, the archipelagos of the Caribbean were the first sites in which the African diaspora occurred, this moving out of the Africa into the Americas. And yes, that is Harry Belafonte Jr., the king of Calypso. In 2018, his song was actually, his whole album was listed in the Library of Congress. Now, Harry Belafonte was born in Harlem in 1927. He is the son of Caribbean immigrants. His father was from the island of Martinique and his mother was from Jamaica. His song is, I guess we would call today a crossover, because it launched his career, but it became very popular with the American audiences. His breakthrough album was Calypso. We're going to be looking at Black explorers first. We're going to start with this group, because the first people who came to the Americas, to Florida, came through the Caribbean into actually Florida. One of the earliest of the explorers, we'll meet later, was Estebanico, or Stephen the Black. And he was, his whole, why is this moving? It shouldn't move. His whole history is linked to an exploration of the continental United States. Now, when we look at the earlier period, though, we look at Columbus. Columbus actually had, as part of his crew, 2 individuals, actually 3 brothers, who were the Nino brothers. And Pedro Alfonso Niño was called El Negro. He was his pilot. And you can see from the pictures here, a kind of a Columbus-looking picture here, but this one is probably more what he looked like. He probably was, we would call a Moro, meaning that his family had ancestry from Northern Africa, but was probably brought in through the period of the Spanish conquest, and probably may have even been born in Spain. He was free. His brothers actually traveled with him, and I think it was the second ship, the Santa Maria, was owned by one of his brothers. So these were free Black men, considered Black even then, who traveled with Columbus in the exploration and would have reached the first islands. And one of those first islands were, we believe, maybe Eleutheria in the Bahamas. They really don't know. He called it San Salvador. But he traveled with Columbus. And he would have been considered what's a Black explorer. Now, in addition to him, we have another Black explorer and conquistador. His name was Juan Garcia. You can see the two pictures here, which are kind of interesting because this was painted in the Spanish style. He lived in Mexico at the end of his life, and he was supposed to be from Angola. Here he has more of a Moor or an Arab look. What makes him significant is that he traveled with, it's moving by itself, I'm sorry. He traveled with Ponce de Leon. He was actually on Ponce de Leon's expedition, the first one to Florida. So he is believed to be the first person of African ancestry who set foot in the continental United States. He came in through the Caribbean, through Puerto Rico, because that's where Ponce de Leon came. And he had lived in Puerto Rico already for a while, as well as Hispaniola. So that would make him kind of an early Afro-Caribbean. Again, he was free. He was not a slave. Now, his expedition with Ponce de Leon was not successful. Ponce de Leon was actually hurt in the second one. The second time he came. So we have him not being able to establish a colony, but Garrido continued in his explorations. And he actually was part of Hernán Cortés team. We see here two pictures painted during the time frame of him with Cortés meeting the Aztecs. You can see him right here. And you can see how they're depicting him here as darker and more like with the Moors, but you can see some of the African features. Garrido will travel with Cortés, will actually gain, he was a conquistador, so he'll actually settle in Mexico eventually, and he will marry there. And that's where we get that picture of him, which may have been a truer, I'll go back to that one. This may have been a truer depiction because he was born in Angola. And this would fit what he might have looked like at the time. And it is, again, painted in the Spanish clothing of the time in Mexico. The first Maroons are people who escaped from slavery, and that's going to be linked to the first actual exploration going into Florida and an attempt to settle Florida. This particular expedition actually contained 100 enslaved Africans, and within 2 months, the expedition completely failed. It was a disaster. It originally had 600 to 700 men, women, children, and African slaves. Now, these will be the first slaves, enslaved Africans brought in. The settlement was abandoned because they were not, after our youngs got sick and died, and they left. By the time they left, there were only 150 survivors, but none of the African slaves returned. It is believed that they escaped into the wilderness, probably into the jungle with the natives who would take people in those days, especially escaped Africans. And nobody knows their story. They basically disappeared. But again, you see here from the Caribbean right into the Americas. And this settlement was in South Carolina. What makes this settlement interesting is that it's going to be like 100 years before Jamestown. The first settlement, European, was before Jamestown. Another first settlement will be St. Augustine, even though we hear about Jamestown. The next person we're going to meet is Estebanico. He had many names. He was a Moor. You can see in this depiction, he has more of the Berber, North African mixture of features. Again, he has here more of an African look. This might be an accurate depiction because he was in Mexico and he did travel with, I think, De Soto into the Southwest. And the reason it might be from that period is because the Spaniards used dogs against the Indians. They had these dogs that traveled with them, and he's dressed in the conquistador, and he would have been a Black conquistador. Now, what makes him a little different is that he was a slave, all right? He was a slave. We know about these two gentlemen and their travels because Garrido requested a pension from the Spanish government. So he talked about himself and he outlined his travels. In the case of Estebanico, Stephen the Black, Estebanico, he traveled with the Spanish expedition. And at the end of the expedition, only 5 had survived from their travel from Santo Domingo through Cuba into Florida, all across the Southwest and back into Mexico. Only 5 of them survived. And Cabeza de Vaca wrote about that those travels. So we have an accurate rendition, and he is there described as a slave. Now, we're going to be looking now at the first Afro-Floridians, and they come to Florida a little differently. Excuse me. What's significant about them in this period is the idea of freedom. Once you escaped from a non-Spanish territory, you would be given freedom. You were guaranteed freedom. All you had to do was convert to be Catholicism, and agreed to serve in the militia. One of the first settlements, one of the first settlements that we have in this area served then as a buffer. It was to protect Spain from, at this point, in the 1600s, colonization or invasion by the English in the north. These Floridians were, we know that they were coming from the Caribbean, and we're going to see why, because of how slaves were brought into the Americas. And they escaped. This was, trying to escape, successful or not, was something that the enslaved Africans would do constantly. So when we have this, different periods of communities being established, but again, what we're going to be looking at now is a different population, because the ones that we looked at were free, except for Esteban, who basically moved around like a free man. And now we're going to look at slaves who escaped. Now, these Floridians were actually Maroons. Maroons mean people who escaped. The largest Maroon community started were contained in Jamaica, the largest, and they were successful in actually gaining independence eventually from the English, right? These individuals were in Florida, are going to come from the north first, but they're going to get here eventually, originally from somewhere in the Caribbean. Now, St. Augustine is actually established in 1565, you see, and this is the Castillo de Moro, but it includes both enslaved and free Africans among the settlers, all right? They were both included. So even though they brought them, they brought free, they also brought enslaved individuals. But Spain was not interested in colonizing Florida. There was no gold. There was no Spanish interested in settling and farming, because they wanted to go to where Cortez and Pizarro went. They wanted the wealth of the Aztecs and Incas. So it was very difficult to attract anybody to Florida at that time. But they did set up this fort at the frontier. It basically had a small militia, and it included Black conquistadores because they were part of the Spanish militia. But then what starts to happen is, in an attempt to increase the population, and we don't know how they got the information, but enslaved Africans in the areas of the Carolinas, Georgia, they started hearing about being able to be free if you went to Spain's territory in Florida. And they did it. All right. This is actually the first railroad, the Southern Railroad for Freedom, the Underground Railroad. And this one is going to move south. This is going to be the basic area, because these are where most of the slaves are coming from, this area of Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, all the way right at the border here, and then into this region. And you'll see how Bahamas are going to be playing an important part in where they actually end up, but also into these territories. As long as you were not a Spanish slave escaping, so it wasn't altruistic, right? You would be free, and this is what happened. So what started happening was the information came in. And one of the things that we see here is the captain, Francisco Menendez. He was part of a militia in the first free Black community established. And he himself was actually an escaped slave. He left the trek from, I'm trying to think, Georgia. And during this trip that he took, which took him like months, with I think about 7 other individuals, he made this trip down to Florida because he had heard, and who knows how they heard this, that if you got there, you would be free. So he was one of the many runaways who took the offer, and he became the commander of the fort. He actually was, was a soldier. And if you recall, in the Americas, escaped slaves could not have weapons. They couldn't have anything. He was a soldier. You see him here depicted in a uniform as a commander with a rifle. So in 1724, he arrived in St. Augustine with 9 other slaves who had fled from Carolina. The 400-mile journey took 3 years, basically hiding in the jungle. And it is believed that they were aided along the way by Native American tribes. So in 1726, 2 years after his arrival, the commander appointed him in charge of the Black Militia. It was a slave militia at this point, but escaped slaves. And then in 1738, the Black Militia was granted unconditional freedom, right? This was, they were independent, and they built this town for them. It's still in the area near St. Augustine, el Pueblo de Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mois. And this was the fort. This was their fort, and they defended it. They defended it until it was destroyed. When it was finally destroyed in the 1700s, they left. He left for Cuba. He took the whole fort and all of the followers, all of the individuals, and they fled to Cuba because this territory belonged to Spain. Gradually, the population started growing, so it grew from his, 9 slaves to 1738 over 100 runaways. And these would be runaways that would bring their wives, women, and children. I mean, this was an incredible trek that they did, seeking their freedom. By 1738, they had additional 23 men and women who had joined. And all of these basically are fleeing from South Carolina. This became like a major escape route. The fort will be, it is a park today. The fort contains, it had soldiers. They wore uniforms, Spanish uniforms, because they were considered a militia. And today they do reenactments of it. So if you want to have a piece of this history, you can go there. Now, there's actually another underground railroad. It's called the Saltwater. And you can guess why. It has to do with water. And this is going to be the trek going to the Bahamas. This was going to be a major route after Florida became a territory of the United States. Andrew Jackson, when he became kind of the governor after Florida was acquired by the U.S., really hit the free cities and towns of escaped slaves. He hit them hard. He destroyed them. They were sold into slavery or they were killed. So once this started to happen, recognizing that being under the United States was not going to be good for them, they started leaving, they started escaping. And the route was to the Bahamas. And this is today the Lighthouse Point in Key Biscayne. This is the area from which they launched their ships. And they went basically to Andros Island. Their community is still there. And this is going to be a constant movement that occurs during this period, especially when the British end the slave trade. And then the Bahamas become one of the major points where slaves from everywhere are introduced into the Bahamas. So the population is going to grow from original people that were brought in as slaves to people from all over the United States and other areas that were freed slaves. What they would do is the British would capture during this, after the slave trade ended, would capture ships, whether they be French, they'd be Spanish, they'd be English, and would take the slaves and bring them to these enslaved people, bring them to the Bahamas. The Bahamas was a key point for them during this period. And it's going to be a constant. Historians believe that in the 1830s, about 6,000 free and enslaved Black people escaped to the Bahamas, all right, just in that one period alone. And this is going to be part of people coming from the north of the United States because you still had slavery in the northern part of the U.S. Now, one of the things that we're going to look now is the mass trafficking. How did these, were they brought into to this region? And I thought this was an appropriate quote because we tend to talk about, about slaves coming out of Africa. And the reality is that people were taken out of Africa. And the language has, been looked at carefully in how we refer to people who were enslaved from these areas. So the mass trafficking of Caribbean peoples is going to be the taking out of people from Africa and then trafficked into the Caribbean and then taken somewhere else. Mostly to this region here. You'll see the colors. This is Brazil, which is where most of the slaves came. This is the coastal area. And the reason that we see this map, this first picture, is because Portugal controlled the slave trade. All right, they basically controlled it for about 100 years. And they were responsible for over 40% of the enslaved people taken out of Africa and brought to the Americas. Now, they would bring them from here into Brazil, actually. All right, so this is kind of like a peak of the triangle. And in Brazil, then when the sugar plantations were established, they used them. And from Brazil, they're going to be brought here to the Caribbean. And then from the Caribbean, they're going to be brought up here. And what started to happen was that the Portuguese realized two things, that sugar was a commodity because that's what they produced, but that slaves were the second commodity. And this is what they called the triangle. And then from here, rum and goods would go to Africa. Any kind of goods that were produced in the colonies. But the Caribbean was a major point. This is where a lot of the enslaved individuals come in. The first enslaved population that sets up the model, it's like a template, was from Barbados. When South Carolina was established, the proprietors who set it up, what they did was they were given a territory to do with what they want. It was one of those colonies that basically they were kings. And what they did is they went to Barbados. Barbados at that point was England's most lucrative sugar colony, but it was too small, much too small. And as a result, needing to expand, right, and also wanting to export sugar, what South Carolina did was that the proprietors actually recruited white slave masters, owners from the Barbados to come, actually farmers, sugar plantation farmers from Barbados to come to Carolina and set up their system of enslaved labor and sugar in the Caribbean. And then from when they came, they brought with them their slaves. And this is going to be a model that will then be put in Jamaica, will be put in basically all of the islands. But it's Barbados that will introduce the first Afro-Caribbeans from Barbados into the islands. And also the other group will be from Jamaica. They have a long history of being brought in. Now, one of the reasons that they wanted to bring them from here also is that these were people that had been enslaved for about 100 years now. Remember I said the Portuguese were in control for 100 years? They didn't want slaves that just came out of Africa. They wanted people that were seasoned. They wanted people that were not fighting anymore. They wanted people that spoke, the language. They did not want to deal with breaking them. And that's what the Portuguese did, basically. They would season them, they would break them psychologically. And then once they were accustomed to slavery, then they were introduced into, sold into these regions. So we have here the first Afro-Caribbean migration of peoples into the Americas and into the areas north of Florida. But then we know when they went to South Carolina, what they did, right? They came back south into Florida to escape slavery and then into the Bahamas and other areas. Now, when we look at the diaspora, we're talking about a different period now. The diaspora is a little different because here we're talking about the actual movement of people. Now, with the diaspora, it's a little bit different because we talk about it being a voluntary migration, but the reality is that it was somewhat voluntary. And the reason that I say that it was somewhat is because many of the people who voluntarily now choose to leave the Caribbean for the Americas, primarily Florida, come on. I guess it's set up on an automatic timer, I'm sorry. These people who will choose to leave, the reason that they're leaving is what we call in sociology push and pull factors. And of course, what are they going to be pulled by? They're going to be pulled by all of the opportunities that they see outside of their countries. And what are they going to be pushed by? Well, in their own countries, they're going to be pushed by poverty. They're going to be pushed by lack of opportunity, whether it be social, economic. They're going to be pushed by economic instability, by political violence. So these are going to be the push factors. So that's why I say that sometimes it wasn't really voluntary. They basically had to make a choice between staying in their countries and having to leave it. And many of these individuals, and this is going to be a pattern of the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean migration, they're going to go leave their country with the thought, I am going back. And I think if you ask any of the earlier Caribbean population, all of the islands, they'll tell you the same thing. The dream is they're going to go back. My father had that dream, and I know that many others did, and some of them do, but most of them don't. Their reality is their families are here, their children are born here, their grandchildren, and things have not necessarily changed in their own country. So you're not going to have such a return. One of the things that we do see very early in this period is migration for different reasons, but it's going to be a big number that starts to leave. If you can see now, by the time we get from this period alone of massive migration, by 2017, 10% of the nation's 45.4 million immigrants are from the Caribbean. I mean, that's like, that's a lot. So we have a period in which more than 90% of the immigrants have reached these areas of from the Caribbean into the United States. Now, most of them are going to come from Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Haiti, and Trinidad. We're going to have numbers from everywhere, but those are going to be the biggest countries that will be sending them out. Now, depending on the period of arrival, they're going to come with different skill levels, and we'll see that as we look at the different groups. what we're going to see is that during the periods of population migration will increase in numbers. And the biggest increase was like 50% every 10 years between 1980 and 2000. So we can see that this is not a migration that has ended either. Now, what is going to be a major pull? A lot of them come, again, to escape their reality, but a lot of them come here to send money home. That's what they want to do. They want to support their families at home. So this is going to be a major attraction, and we're going to see this with all the communities. Even if they stay here, they still send money home. Now, in the last, you can see the number, you can see the millions here. The group with the largest percent was the Dominican Republic. 54% came from there. The next one is going to be Jamaica, 21%. All right, and then Haiti, 20%, very high. So this level of dependence on sending money from the Americas, from the United States, is what has kept many of these societies surviving, and a reason why they make the sacrifice. And you can see that for generations, they've done it to sustain their societies. This is how these societies have been able to stay somewhat functional. Now, what kind of skills do they come from? In the employment sectors, you can see that the Caribbean immigrants, they really are in all kinds of occupations. But you see that there's some pretty high numbers compared to the overall population between all immigrants and native born for the Caribbean population, especially the service, no surprise, depending on the group, because you have a population with different skills that come in. Now, where do they go? Well, New York, has been a major attraction from early history. But notice the sex major draw, right? Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach. So it's Florida. And then we have Orlando, and then we have Tampa. So if you look at the list, you actually have Florida represented, by 4 different communities that attracts them. And it has to do a lot with existing populations here too. We're going to look at the Bahamian because they are the smallest in a way, but they are also one of the most historic. Now here we're going to look at people that claim Bahamian ancestry. That will mean that they might be current immigrants, or their family may have been here since like the 16 or 1700s. So all we're looking at is the idea of pretty much self-identification. And considering how small the Bahamas are in population even, this is a big number, all right? The first wave lasted between the 70s and the 1900s, and we are going to see that it's going to be concentrated in Key West. Now, Key West, what drew them because close to the Bahamas, and they used to come as wreckers and also to do the sponging and to do the fishing, but particularly wrecking was very important because you had all of those Spanish galleons and other ships that kind of crashed. But there was actually even, earlier than that, a population in the Keys, pretty high, because this is where they're going to stay. One of the problems with the Bahamas is it's very small to begin with, and it has a very limited amount of arable land. So because of this, it's about 2% arable land. Because of this, they really can only practice what we call subsistence agriculture. So basically, they have always thought of a life on the sea. And fishing was part of it, sponging is another, but that's still not enough. So one of the things that effectively will draw them to Key West, for example, part of it was at some point the cigar industry. Another one is just settlement there. They were just drawn to different kinds of projects. But you'll see that by 1892, 8,000 of the 25,000 people in Key West were Bahamian. So again, this is a pretty large population. We're going to see at some points that more Bahamians so many Bahamians were leaving that the Bahamas actually got alarmed because they were losing their population of workers, especially young men. Now, when we look at this period in this community, they are still there. I don't know how current this picture is, but the Bahama Village still has that flavor and history of Bahamas. It now has become basically a very high restaurant. It's always been a tourist area. It's right next to Old Town. But I was told this picture might not be current. I couldn't find anything current. And now some very high-end restaurants are located in this area. But it has contained the idea, the history of it. And this is, again, one of the things that happens, as I mentioned, people leave to go home, but they don't. They basically do end up staying. Now, once the lighthouses, once the lighthouses started to be set up and the ships were kind of cleared, you didn't have too many wrecks occurring. So wreckers ends as a possibility of employment for many of the Bahamians. So they're going to now be attracted by something else. And they're going to be attracted to now more into Miami area, and they're going to be considered the second wave. And what they came to was basically as a labor force in all of the projects of Miami. They provided the major labor force, whether it was building the city of Miami, or whether it was the railroad or the new capitalist farms that were established. So they're going to be really the backbone of Miami's development during this time. Miami was a very small city, right? It wasn't even founded until, I'm trying to remember the date now. It's not going to be founded until, no, I can't find it. I'm sorry. I can't remember the date. But you'll have, as early as the 1890s, already Bahamians coming for agricultural work. And what's going to happen is they're going to start going and settling in these areas. And in Miami, the key area will be what we know as Coconut Grove. That's going to be a major up for them. Now, one of the other things that they become involved in, at the time Henry Flagler starts to build a railroad, he also starts a tourism industry, and tourism starts to develop. So we're going to have a lot of the Bahamians working not only in construction, but they're going to be working, they're going to be working in Miami, in the tourist industry, whether it's cooks, maids, laundry, porters. So they had basically two areas of employment in Miami, the hotel industry and the railroad. Some of them became porters in the railroad after the building of the railroad all the way down to southern Florida. So, but Mike, in this period, this is going to be basically the two things that they do. Now, not all of the Bahamians who came are going to be from a lower class or unskilled. You're going to have some that were from middle class and they actually brought capital. But one of the things we're going to see happening for the wave of Bahamians, it's going to actually stop. It's going to start to decrease for several reasons. One of them is going to be the immigration quotas and restrictions. And we're not going to see a major flow until actually 1943 to 47. And if you note the dates, it's the war. And they about 70,000 West Indians, including Bahamians, were brought in to work in the farms in the United States, but especially Florida, because of course the men were off to fight the war, and the women and men who stayed behind were working in the factories. And even Black Americans saw an opportunity. African Americans that were not from the island saw an opportunity to work in jobs that paid more money. And for the Bahamians, since they rarely got paid in cash in the Bahamas, the idea of jobs, the idea of high wages, and the idea of being paid in cash, regardless of what they did, was something that attracted them. Another issue is that the large farm corporations wanted them because they were immigrants. And they knew that they could treat them however they wanted, they could pay them however they wanted, because all they had to do was say, hey, we'll send you back home. And because they made much more money here than they could ever make at home, they stuck it out. It became part of the population. But one of the things that started happening is, and this is very early actually, about the 1850s, the Bahamas started looking at tourism. And they got the idea, I guess, partly also from Flagler. He will be one of the individuals that would build a hotel in the Bahamas. And you're going to start then the Bahamas creating a reverse flow of migration. Today, the Bahamian tourist industry employs 50% of the Bahamian workforce. So that's a pretty large number. And this is going to cut down a lot on the number of individuals that will have to migrate from the Bahamas. Now, with this change in migration, what we're going to have then is not too much of a trickle of coming in, but we're going to have an established older population in the country. Permanent settlements, okay? The permanent settlements, oh, here it is. 1896 is Miami. It will be Miami. By this period, I mean, it was chartered in 1896, but at this point, there were already more than 40% of the population that was Black was Bahamian. So they really were the core foundation of the establishment of Miami. And Coconut Grove is going to be the home of the pioneer families. And it still is. This is where they're still located. This is where their primary population is. Now they have moved into other areas, into Fort Lauderdale and to Palm Beach. They have spread out, but this still is predominantly, the Grove is still predominantly their community. Now, what do we know about them in terms of some characteristics? Again, majority still living around Miami. 32% of the Bahamian Americans hold college degree. That's a very high population, percentage of the population, but also of the Afro-Caribbean. And these degrees, we have, not yet. These degrees, a lot of them you see are graduate and professional degrees. Their jobs very highly concentrated in business, science, and the arts. And then the other areas are office positions. And then the remainder is going to be different kinds of service industries. Now, they've left their imprint. This community is still very vibrant, and they left their imprint in many ways with food and their contributions to the community. But one of the major things that we have that they left behind, and you know what it is Gumbe and Junkunu, right? So let's hear a little Junkunu music, okay? Familiar?
Don't hear anything.
Oh, you can? Okay, I'm sorry. I have it as loud as I can. Sorry. Did you hear the first one though, when I had it?
No, we didn't hear the first one either.
Oh, I'm sorry then. I don't know why it's not playing. Well, Junkanu is the music of the Caribbean. It is not, and the Gumbe Festival is not linked to Carnival. They're completely different. This tradition comes from specifically the Protestant and the English. And they actually, whereas Carnival is linked to the Catholic tradition and Lent, this one is basically a festival that was allowed by the British for their enslaved people during the holidays, especially Christmas, and they would celebrate. And the traditions are to dress up, to have the different instruments. The music is very lively. We tried the music. It worked the other day. I'm so sorry. Yeah, the music is also part of the presentation. Sorry. And they do dress up. This is a big deal. And you have even groups from the Bahamas come over to do the festival. It's usually held in June in Coconut Grove. And there's also a festival held in the Key West. Okay, so we can't hear the music. Sorry. Disappointing. Prominent Bahamians. Okay, we're going to look at a few prominent Bahamians, and you should know some of them. You may be surprised at some of them. When we look at the prominent Bahamian community, one of the key people that we're going to look at right now is going to be W.E.B. Dubois, founder of the NAACP with Mary White. Now, he was born free in Massachusetts, Grand Barrington, Massachusetts. He will eventually live in Philadelphia. He was a sociologist. He's the first African-American to receive a PhD from Harvard University. He studied in Europe with Max Weber, who's a prominent sociologist, not yet, prominent sociologist. And he's the founder, again, one of the founders of the NAACP. His father was from the Bahamas. Now, we're not gonna look, well, also his name tells you he has some French. His grandfather was from the Bahamas. His father was from Haiti. So here we have two populations coming to the Americas. And what happens very often here in the United States is that we have a population that is, very often mixes, a lot of mixture of cultures and races here within the Afro-Caribbean community and the American community. Now, this is another list of different prominent Bahamians, okay? And I think you know some of them. I don't know if, this is Lenny Kravitz, okay? This is his mother, all right? His mother we know Esther Raleigh from Good Times, but she was from the Jeffersons. Remember? I'm trying to remember what her name was. She was Helen Willis, and she was married. It was a very, liberal presentation at that time. She was part of a mixed marriage in the Jeffersons, right? Her husband was white. Her son is Lenny Kravitz. This gentleman over here is Al Roker. He's a meteorologist, near related. Here we have Portier, okay, he's also actor, British, success in Britain, but he's Bahamian. We have the Maori group here. I remember Sister. And then we have here Frederica Wilson, all right? a congresswoman, right? Here we have, so her name is, okay, M. Atherley Rain. She was born in Key West, parents were the Bahamas, and she was very significant because in 1965, she became the first African-American to serve in the Miami, Florida City Commission, and the first African-American since Reconstruction to head a Florida state agency. You know who this is, right? No, come on. I said, you look familiar, okay? So there we have Clay Thompson and his father, Michael Thompson, okay, Bahamian background. I think we also have here Eric Gordon. His mother was from the Nassau Bahamas. And here we have Tito Holford. Now, Tito Holford actually was born in the Dominican Republic and is listed as a Dominican player. But Tito's father, Al's father, Tito, his father was from the Bahamas. So his grandfather was Bahamian. So we can see that they're present in our population today in the arts, in professional and politics. Definitely sports, and music and sports has been two of the major areas where historically African Americans and definitely Afro-Caribbeans have had opportunities. Okay, let's look at a few of the other communities now. Real quick because we lost time. But the next largest population are the Jamaican ancestry. There's over 1 million living in the United States. They actually are a community has been here a long time. And over 70% of the population of Afro-Caribbeans come basically from Jamaica, and the next population, the next country is Haiti. Now, Jamaica is an interesting population because it does have a lot of mixed ancestry. So we're going, but they list the population is basically 92% African ancestry, direct African ancestry. And then you have the mixed race. And this is one of the things we're going to see start to appear. Now, the first Jamaicans that were chronicled to come to the United States actually came in 1619. You hear very often about those first slaves that were brought to Virginia. And these people were actually free. They were not enslaved Africans living in Jamaica who came in as indentured servants, and they did their time there, and then they actually were free, and they got land, and they ended up owning slaves. So this is probably the first documented immigration to the United States of the Jamaicans. They also came in many ways. It's going to be a pattern, and since the turn of the century, it's going to be 3 waves. Most of the immigrants from the Caribbean at this point are going to come from Jamaica. And yearly, they have from 10 to 15,000 Jamaicans are still brought today to Florida as contract workers. They do work, cultural work that needs to be done. And this is an example of coming here and then going back home. Now, Jamaicans in Florida, they constitute the largest West Indian group, even in Florida. Their largest concentration is Broward County. They have elected 2 commissioners and a mayor in Lauderdale Lakes. Kendall was one of their original enclaves, but they have spread out, and evidently Lauderdale still has this name, finally known as Jamaica Hill. So when we look at the population, 25% of the U.S. Jamaican population actually lives in Florida, right? Can you hear that?
Mm-hmm.
No? Nothing?
Nothing,
No.
sorry.
No? Okay, I'm so sorry about the music. Not
Turn
working.
Marley.
No, it's as loud as I can put it. It's just not picking it up from the computer. I don't know why. And we did test it, so it should have worked. I have no idea why it's doing that, and I apologize. Anyway, the key person here we're looking at is Bob Marley. He became definitely a renowned figure worldwide. His introduction of music, reggae music in particular, became something that was basic, much like what Calypso happened with Belafonte. This is what Marley did for reggae in the Americas. So this would be another example of crossover music, and it was popular worldwide. I mean, he died, and he's had monuments everywhere. This is just one statue of him, but his popularization of the reggae music throughout the world continues to be something that is linked to his heritage and his legacy. He is the most widely known performer, and it's the music that is most often linked to the diaspora by not only the Jamaicans, but I think almost the entire Afro-Caribbean, because his songs tell a lot about this needing to leave the homeland and returning home and the nostalgia. He basically also did kind of open the world to Rastafari, the religion, widely unknown and misunderstood. It was introduced partly introduced by Marcus Garvey, another Jamaican who lived in New York, but it was Marley was going to bring it worldwide recognition, and through the Caribbean attract a lot of adherents, not just from Jamaica, including in the United States. Right? And it's also linked, the religion and the music are very much linked. The religion has its theology, and then the music kind of tells you the story. Okay, the next population we're going to look at is the Trinidad and Tobago. I'm not even going to try and say how they're called. I'm going to get tongue-tied. This is a very small island, but again, a large population living in the United States. Now, with the Trinidad Tobago population, their immigration has historically been to England, the United States, and Canada. And Florida, it was New York, basically. Florida is a much more recent migration. Small in size when compared to the other islands, but it does have this issue of a lot of its people choosing to leave. Now the population of Trinidad and Tobago is a little different, and something has happened in Trinidad and Tobago which is kind of unique. You notice that they have an African population that is listed 34% as being African ancestry, with history way back to the colonial times. But you notice that the major population, the largest group, are actually Indian. And these are, in the Indian group are all people from South Asia that were brought in to work. But mostly they're going to be people from India itself, all right? This is also going to include a Chinese population. What happened here is that in Trinidad, while you do have this breakdown, they self-identify a lot as mixed, and they have breakdown based on the group. So the Dougla is mixed African Indian. So they specify more than race specifically, they also identify these different breakdowns. Now, many of them came to the United States again during early periods of migration. And this population is a little different. We have a large group that comes to the United States actually after World War II, because during World War II, the United States had bases in Trinidad. And it was part of the Lend-Lease program. It was how we supported England before we actually got into the war. So you had a lot of people in Trinidad, especially around the base area, who interacted with the United States. And after the war, they were able to come in. A lot of them came as students, but a lot of them came professional to live and work here. We're going to have different periods of immigration, but the biggest group time frame will be the 60s. And this is another mixed migration, because what happens in Trinidad is it's actually one of the wealthier islands because of the oil. So you're going to have a lot of white Trinidadians leaving because the population becomes increasingly Black in terms of political control. And they're going to be a more educated class, some with capital, and they're going to come here. And then you're going to have this shift in Trinidad of the Indian and African with the growing population, where at one point the Indian population will actually take over the political structure. And you're going to have more of the Black and mixed population of Trinidad opting to leave for opportunities here. So not to compete in these areas. Now, the Indian population and Chinese also, they have a pretty large, not large, but they have a population of Chinese immigrants. They came starting in the 1800s as indentured servants to work in agriculture. This was very common in Asia. It's still very common in India. And they were brought to agriculture because the Black population at this point were free, were in positions of political power and economic, and they did not want to work the land. They saw the land as linked to their slavery. So you're going to have a need for labor, and that's where this population will come in. But this is not an enslaved population again. This is an indentured population. Once they became free, they take over the land. So most of the land holdings, a lot of it now is held by these, what they call Indo-Trinidadians. And in Trinidad, the population of African is low, but in the island of Tobago, 85% of the population is of African ancestry is Black. Again, their immigration is from very early, the same way that the Barbados served as a seasoning. Trinidad was part of the seasoning. So a lot of the earliest African slaves were brought through Trinidad into North America. And again, where it was a clearinghouse, so this is where they were brought brought in and then shipped to the other islands in the Americas, and the seasoning camp. This is part of their very early history. Population of Trinidad came in different ways, as I mentioned. The largest wave starts between this period. What opens them up is the civil rights era and the change in the quotas, because a lot of the quotas up until this period really demonstrated how they were based on race and how they were very discriminatory to certain areas. So once that opens up, you're going to have a large wave from Trinidad coming. But a lot of them originally actually came as students or to meet family, and they were here illegally. They call themselves Trinis, for short, which is easier. They represent the second largest group in the United States. And Florida contains the fourth largest population within the Caribbean, all right? They have their carnival, which is very important also culturally. Big costumes, they have the kitty carnival, and their key instrument is going to be the steel pan, which is basically made from the oil drums, which is part of the oil industry. And I'm going to rush it here. The Haitian community is another community who's been here a long time, but has had periods of larger migration. One of the key individuals from their history that we're going to meet right now is JeanBaptiste du Sable, who is the founder of Chicago. Okay? He came from Haiti, settled in the area of Chicago in the 1700s, and actually established the city. And he's recognized in Chicago with this statue. We also have a group of Haitians that participated, who came to fight in the United States. They came with the French, who supported the United States in the American Revolution, and they fought in the Battle of Savannah. And this statue was dedicated to them. This young man may be Henri Christophe, a later political revolutionary, I think king of Haiti, or emperor, he titled himself. But this was done in Savannah to honor their contribution. The immigration was again, it has waves, and you can see that of the political here. Okay, Dubois' dictatorship is going to be dominant. Then we're going to have blue collar and semi-skilled with the opening up of the quotas for African or for Caribbean. Then in the 70s, we're going to have the boatload. So this is going to be a massive and constant population. One of the issues with the boatload population is that while they allowed the Cuban immigrants to come in, they would send them back. So this has been a controversial issue between these communities of how some groups, especially the Black population, has been treated differently than other populations. And then, of course, the last major movement was the earthquake. 55,000 Haitian immigrants granted temporary visas. So Haitian Florida, the largest enclave, as you know, is in the city, right? And they're concentrated everywhere: Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Deerfield Beach, and of course, New York City has a large population. Today, they represent 7,000 to 10,000 of the workers in agriculture in the state. They have two names for them, actually, depending on what they do. When they work in Florida, they're called stoopers. I guess they're bending down to pick up, whether it's tomatoes or other. And then when they go to Georgia and those areas, they're called reachers because they reach for fruits, for trees, apples, and all that. But they have become, on the East Coast, continue to be a major migrant worker in the agricultural fields. And in Florida, they have communities where they still live in pockets, and then this is the kind of work they do. You could still see them in Homestead, or you did. When I left there working in some of the fields in Homestead, although that's decreasing because those fields are kind of disappearing in Homestead. Again, the music and culture is very important to the population. Haiti was very significant historically because it was the first country to not only remove and end slavery, but to also end its colonization. So they have become really, an example of a part of a tribute or looking to a connection for the Black communities of freedom. So this is one of their basic, contributions to that early period of civil rights, even for Black Americans, that you can do it, you can get your freedom, you can come free, you can gain your rights. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of neglect of the island, and it was never, for many reasons, and again, not enough time to go into it, that it really never reached its potential. Now, the other populations, just real quick, just to see, because we forget about them, and we have Afro-Caribbeans in the Spanish communities, all right? The largest percentage in numbers, if you can see, people who identify are the Afro-Cuban. We have the Afro-Dominican and the Afro-Puerto Rican. What makes this population a little different is the question of identity and self-identity, and that we don't really have true numbers, all right? But you can see that 34% of the population is self-identifying pretty much as African ancestry. Dominican Republic, this number is very low. But you're going to have a tendency there of self-identification as either European, white, or mixed, regardless of how you look. They're not using physical traits. And Puerto Rico has the smallest number. Now, what makes this curious is that in the United States, if you use the rule of identification, identify as black or white, if you apply the one-drop rule, all of these groups that I put here, all of these groups would be listed as black, because it doesn't matter how you look. It's the idea that you have a percentage. So if you have any percentage, they will not let you choose which group you are. You're not black and white, or you're not white if you have white ancestor. You automatically carry the black, which is what makes this number, and maybe this number too, very high. In Puerto Rico, we seem to have more of a tendency to self-identify and the population as having black ancestry. It was something that was not really hidden in the island. That doesn't mean there wasn't discrimination and questions of status. It just has a different attitude toward it. It's also a much smaller population and concentrated in the north of the island, so that may make a difference. The largest population, as I mentioned, are Cuban ancestry, and we are done. Basically, we know where the Cubans are concentrated. Their history has been Miami, but they are historically, they were always here. They came earlier working in the cigar industry. And the most famous of the African we know is Our Lady here, Celia Cruz. I chose this picture of her because there were so many, I didn't know which one, but you can see that there was a stamp to honor her. And even though salsa basically was born in New York City within the Puerto Rican and Cuban community, she is considered the queen of salsa, because another one who basically introduced this to such a large worldwide audience, not just within the Cuban community. And she's considered one of the most successful performers. And of course, the community also has, the Afro-Caribbean also has played a very important role and major contributions in the Afro-Cuban jazz, or jazz. And here we have Dizzy Gillespie, who started working with Machito and other Cuban players in New York City, and started a movement called Cubop, which was a mixing of the Cuban music with bebop. But then we have just also the traditional, here he is. We also have the traditional Afro-Cuban jazz. Here we have one of the earlier Mario Balsa, and then a much more current, recently died, Bebo Valdez, who really have taken these blends of American jazz with the Cuban or Latin sounds and music from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Cuba, and fused it into what we call today the Afro-Cuban jazz. Okay, guys. I'm sorry that the music didn't play. I had that to entertain you, but it's done. But I hope you liked my presentation. This is just a list of famous, other distinguished, because we have so many. I couldn't list them all, but I thought you might want to see other people, some people that might surprise you. One that surprised me, and I'm Puerto Rican, was this one. Did you know Sammy Davis Jr.? His mother was Puerto Rican.
That surprises me.
In my research, I discovered that. Yeah, it's incredible, right? But I'm sure you know some of them. And again, I picked a mix of people from different areas. And you can see, today, some historical period, but some modern people. We have a lot of sports that today, because that's been like, again, music and sports and the arts have been the areas where they've had the most success.